Welcome back to The Art of Growth. This is Jim Zartman, and today Joel Hubbard and I are talking about the meaning of life. Just a small topic, the meaning of life. But before we jump into that, you can head to our website, theartofgrowth.org, to take a free Enneagram test or instincts test, the combination of which is really helpful for self-understanding. That's also the place to sign up for our newsletters, where some good stuff will be coming out. And this is a reminder, there's only a couple weeks left to register for the next round of our IEA accredited Enneagram certification. If you think it's time for you to go deeper into the tool, to explore yourself and see where else it leads you. And if you're interested in having Joel and I come in and train in your organization, that's the best place to reach out to us too, theartofgrowth.org. But as we are starting to lean into this season where we've been talking a lot about identity, last year was a lot on belonging, relationship, community, and this next period of time, we're going to be talking about meaningful work. We want to talk about the meaning of life as you head toward the new year and consider what is for you in the new season. So let's go ahead and jump in with today's episode. Over the summer, a friend of mine put out on Facebook that he was going to do like a concert that night in the park. And about, 20 of us or so showed up in the park at sunset, and he was just playing music as the sun went down. And it was really fun. And it's just a warm, friendly environment. And he just said, anybody have any questions? And people asked a couple of things. And then one person asked the question. They said, yeah, I got a question. What's the meaning of life? And everyone laughed.
Oh, that's
right?
Great. Yeah.
Everyone laughed. And I've seen that joke before. I've seen things where people are like, ask a question, what's the meaning of life? Ha, 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 we can't answer this. And I was like, no, I can answer that. I can absolutely answer that.
All right.
I feel like I can absolutely answer the question, what is the meaning of life?
Okay.
And I think the meaning of life is to give life meaning. Patrick Otuma, he's an Irish poet, and he says, you will find meaning where you give meaning.
That's good.
That, to me, is the meaning of life. It's not some external thing that you have to discover. But like we say about identity, the meaning also is both discovered and created equally.
Yeah.
And so the meaning of life is to give life meaning.
Yeah. And to discover. Because I think there is giving meaning to life. And then there's also the continued discovery of meaning. And then there's giving, and then there's discovering. Very much like how everything else works in life, right?
Yes.
It's like, is math something invented or discovered? It's both.
It's both, yeah.
Right? That's the best answer we have. Almost anything that's true at that larger level, that higher level, is true in that way, that it is something that you have a sense of, that you perceive as being very real.
Yeah.
Like the concept of numbers is so real, and yet it's extremely conceptual. Is there such thing as the number one in the physical world? No. It's a concept, but it is real.
It's very much real. Yeah.
And from that, we make things. They become more real. It becomes something physically manifested, and so we draw the number one, and that's a physical representation of that concept. And so, there's been lots of studies around language and the formation of numbers, the formation of language, and how it's not just made up. It's something that seems to emerge. I was listening to one podcast where I was even talking about how consonants are really developed from the crashing sounds that we experienced even prior to developing language.
Oh, interesting.
It's so fascinating, right? And to me, it blew my mind to think well, that makes all the sense. To me, it wasn't like, that doesn't make sense. Yes, it makes sense, because everything emerges from both something that's already present within us and something that's beyond us, right? And that truth is in every dimension, everywhere in life we see it.
Yeah. It's funny when you said that, I thought of the interview with John Williams, the most prolific composer of the generation, most epic soundtracks ever. And somebody was asking him, why did he think that music scores were so impactful in film? And he said he thinks it's because there are these natural elements that are triggered by certain sounds in musical. So like the woodwinds and the flutes and stuff like that, it reminds us of like birds singing in nature. There's something about the drums that sound like crashing and storms. And he was talking about like creating the theme to Jaws, which is that two notes, which he says it sounds like it's coming up from under the water.
Very
it's
good.
Like
that's
haunting.
true. Yeah.
And so he says the reason you feel something when you see this is because it is connected to something that is actually a deeper part of all of nature and who we are. And that's why we actually look at that and then it feels meaningful. Because sometimes, I don't know, I actually have a hard time when I look at a certain movie or something, I'm like, why are people so obsessed with this? I always have to know the why behind everything. It's like my life obsession to know the thing behind the thing. And so when I see something that seems to have an enormous impact, I'm like, but why? What are people getting from this? And it's tapping into something that all of us are trying to feel or trying to name. And I think we have often a really hard time doing it. But it's actually right. It's absolutely at the center of it.
Yeah. And that's why we say meaning is something that is both discovered and created in that rhythm of doing that throughout our lives. I mean, it may not even be a rhythm that we would discern, but it may be just like, oh, this event took place out of the suddenlies. You know, I wasn't expecting this, and something happens and it shatters our current sense of meaning, but then over time yields to a deeper sense of meaning. And there's epiphanies generally around that. It's like, oh, wow, I didn't see that, right? So that's the sort of when the meaning is discovered. And then from that discovery, then we re-engage life with more meaning, right? It's interesting how that happens. It's like, now I'm going about life with more intentionality, doing things that line up with my greater sense of meaning now. And when I do that, it produces even more meaning. So I do think that there's a sort of like upward cycling or upward spiraling, if you will, when we're doing that kind of dance with meaning.
Yeah. That reminds me of a conversation I had with a mentor who I was trying to figure out where I was going. I knew that one season of my life was going to be coming to an end and that I just wasn't going to be able to do that thing anymore. And I was talking about this. I was like, but this is where I've been for so long and I should just stay in my lane. I should kind of continue, but I really want to do this thing over here. Like this would be really meaningful to me. I would love this, but I just don't know if it's for me or if it's right for me or I should, or I was asking all those questions. And he just looked at me. He's like, well, why wouldn't you just assume that is for you to do? Because that's not like everyone wants to do that. I don't want to do that. There was so much freedom for me when he was just like, well, I don't want to do that. And somebody has to. And I remember talking to a friend of mine who's a tax attorney. And I'm like, I'm so glad there's people in the world like you. And I'm so glad I'm not one of them.
Yeah, right.
Because there is something about like, if you have a deep desire that it'd be meaning for you to participate something, why would you not assume that it is for you to do in some way? Now, be careful. We talked about this back in like the Purpose Trap episode where sometimes people think I have to discover like my passion and then I have to like make it my whole life and I have to earn a living from it and all that. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is doing something meaningful because you think it's meaningful, not attached to the result of it needing to be a specific thing.
It does manifest in the physical as a physical thing. Like I love playing guitar. It manifests as I play guitar. But underneath that, it isn't about just the guitar. There's something deeper in you that even prior to the invention of a guitar, you would have been doing. Right?
Gregorian chant, something, wherever I would have been.
There would have been something about strings somewhere or vocals or like something. Yeah. When we say meaning, like in that sense, it's like, yes, there's something you do with meaning. Like you could have 10 firemen, let's say, right? You have these people lined up. You know, we get men and women who are firefighters. And you could ask them, why do you do what you do? What's the meaning to what you do? Now, there's the greater sense of meaning. It's like, well, we want to put fires out, save lives, save property as much as we can, At the larger level, you're going to get sort of a universal, like,
Yes.
we're here to do this, right?
Right.
But then when you get deeper but what is the meaning for you? When do you feel that sense of unique contribution in the work that you do?
Yeah.
It's going to be different.
Yeah.
And that's what we mean by like remembering your meaning, because that's easy to lose. Remembering why it is you do what you do. And so there's both the meaningful in the sense of like it's manifested in some physical dimension, but there's something underneath that that's even deeper that has to do much more with your unique contribution in that space.
I think it was early COVID. I did one of these online workshops for a day because there's nothing going on. I did one with Elizabeth Gilbert and Rob Bell. And they took us through this exercise where they said, all right, I want you to write down like everything you're afraid of, everything that you're concerned about, everything you're worried about. Just write them all out. And so we took a time and we made up a page. And to make a long story short, then they went through this long exercise of writing out all the things that we loved, that were important to us, the people we cared about. It just was this very specific, nuanced thing about what we loved, what we found meaning in. And then they said, all right, if you go back to the fears, and a bunch of people, you read the fears, you notice there's a lot of similarity. We have a lot of the same concerns about, relationships and are we going to have what we need in our resources and our meaning and our job? Like we have a lot of concerns and fears they're pretty much the same. But what you love is what makes you unique. And going through this whole process and then just saying like the things that you wrote down that you love will not look like anyone's list here. It'll be completely unique.
Well, and even more unique would be how you love, because it's what you love. You can have like 5 people saying, "Oh, I love accounting."
But the reason,
but what's behind that? How do you go about it? The guy that does our accounting, he is a people person. I mean, every time I've ever gotten on the phone to talk to him about something, it ends up diverting to a lot more about how are we doing, what's happening, family, friends.
Yeah.
He is so relational. And so you wouldn't get that from every accountant. And it's funny, I asked a few years back, we had to hire an architect. And so we hired this guy, and I asked him, what's your favorite part about doing design work? And,
doing architecture?
Yeah. What's your favorite? But you're designing things, you're drawing, you're writing things up. You do all kinds of things you're doing. And his eyes lit up. He was a heart type for sure. I'm pretty sure he was a type 2. But he smiled as he said, Joel, it's getting to meet people and hear their stories. And I love doing that. And opening the door and getting people to talk about themselves and, things that are personal to them and then getting to do the work that helps them in some way. Yeah. Which was like, well, that's so interesting because would be very different than, say, another architect and so you could have 5 architects who say, oh, I love doing, the work that I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then it's like the question is, but how do you go about doing the work you do? What's the thing that makes it so enjoyable to you, that brings a big smile to your face, that warms your heart? And I think that gets really pretty unique and pretty awesome to hear that. And,
yeah, that reminds me of Lin-Manuel Miranda, the guy who wrote Hamilton. Yeah, and then he went on to do Moana and In the Heights, and he did all these different things. And they were talking to him about why he was so great at these different things, and he says, "My entire job is to fall in love."
Yeah,
and I love that statement. Yeah. It's like my job in the world is to fall in love. And then to go for it. And because the thing is, when you're in love, you do things that nobody will see. Like I won't go into the whole nerdy thing, but there's a whole thing about the song in Moana where she says, how far I'll go. And it's like where she'll go is the sea. And so he actually starts in a different key. And then every time she sings the main note, it's out of the normal key, which is the note C. And so he puts all of these musical things in where they'll go, and the movement of the notes has to where I'll go, and then it ends on the sea.
On the sea. Wow, that's
because where is she going?
fascinating. Yeah,
the sea.
Yeah.
So like
Really clever.
you fall in love, and then you all of a sudden you're more integrated, and you're hiding meaning that no one else is even
because it
gonna
brings
see.
you joy.
Because it brings you joy.
Yeah.
Because you fell in love.
Yeah. I think it's beautiful. And it really is inspiring to think about, and very, very, experientially, I can think of that. That's true for me every time I have ever been in a place of real love. So that's what I try to do with clients, is to bring them back sometimes to when your heart is full and you just love. What do you do? Who are you and how are you? How do you do you? How do you engage the world? And generally speaking, at that point, we're back to being like children. And that's usually where that creative and that unique expression of, again, our contribution, the thing that brings us meaning, that then eventually gets, obviously gets expressed through a particular role that's already existing in the world, or you create one, but that's why, it's like people go, what's the job I should take on? It's like, that's the wrong question. It's
right.
What do you want to do? And then there might be something already out there that gives you at least a good percentage of that you can live out.
Yeah, and don't assume you know what form it's going to take, because a lot of times people's dreams and their skill sets are not always intertwined. And this is why we have hobbies. I love hobbies. I will never be a professional jiu-jitsu competitor. I'm middle-aged. It's just like not going to be a thing.
Yeah.
But it's a great outlet. It's a great way to get exercise. I love it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a hobby. It's a passion, but it's a hobby. There's other things that are very much a skill set. And I think a lot of times we assume, or we only look at familiar models when we see an outlet for a skill set, that maybe your passion and skill set actually creates something new. And this is something that I think is deeply important to me when it comes to meaning, and that is creativity. So creativity is actually what makes us free. So follow me on this train of thought for a second. I don't believe that the opposite of pessimism is optimism. I believe the opposite of pessimism is creativity, because you are taking everything that is known and you are making what has never been known, that you are generating the new. And there is, I think, very few things that are as meaningful as generating what is new, what hasn't been seen, that makes people go, oh, what is that? And so as long as we are in the imitation phase of life, we aren't getting to the innovation where we are generating something new. I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and he brought up, he goes, yeah, our country was literally created. It was a creative act because it wanted to be free from another country's oppression or what it perceived as not being able to express itself the way it wanted to express itself. And so we're always looking for ways to express ourselves. And it requires creativity to create meaning, to really be free. And for some reason, after that conversation popped up in my head this morning when I woke up, was the Gettysburg Address, the 7 years ago, our forefathers set forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It's a conception, and you're creating something. Yep. And in that creativity, you're generating meaning. I also think of this because the way our brains work, it can't be creative and fearful at the same time. Right. Which is why power structures, the power structures that be, the news, the outlet, the clickbait, all this stuff, it uses fear as a tactic, because fear shuts down creativity. So the more you're scrolling, the less creative you are. Right. And the less meaning you're going to experience, because it's going to be activating the circuits of the brain that make you less creative and therefore make you less capable of accessing meaning and what matters to you.
Well, it also generates envy, right? So there's like both fear, but then there's also envy that plays a role at robbing us of our creativity. Because envy is comparative. It's when we get into the comparison
game. Thief of joy, right?
Yeah, it's the thief of joy, and it's everything is somewhat circular, right? So joy produces creativity, creativity produces joy, meaning gives us a sense of creativity gives us a sense of meaning. There's no starting point. There's no like, here's where you start. There's a linear fashion in which you're going to get to the point of experiencing meaning. And that's maybe frustrating to us, but if you think about where we're moving as a human race with the development of AI, some of the best thinkers have said, right, you got to be thinking about is creativity, because the doing, the executing of things will likely be taken over by AI.
Yeah.
But the creative stuff, it's a long ways away. We're going to be doing, we're going to be doing a lot of the creativity. I was watching an interview with a sculptor who uses an AI and robotic machine to help him sculpt.
Oh, okay.
And there are the purists who are saying, but that's not sculpting because you have to do. And his argument was like, no, it frees me to do a bit more of the creativity.
Yeah.
Like I get to envision even as it's creating how I want to shift something, or, hey, wow, that was great, but we could do it even different. It's like, it frees the space for more of that. So that's where we're heading, I think, as a human race, is more towards that. Man, that's the wonderful freedom of moving from being a survival species to a species that may be able to actually thrive. And that thriving, from surviving to thriving, really involves a whole lot of creativity to be able to think beyond what is.
Right.
And I also want to say this because a number of people have said, clients have said to us, well, I'm not creative. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Like, and by the way, a lot of times I've heard them from fours, because those fours will say, it's in the description of the four, and we're like, well, it's not in the description. I don't think it's in our description. I think we've taken it out. Because it's silly to me. Like, fours are creative. Well, every type is creative, right?
Everyone is creative.
It's just that you're going to have to figure out what your creativity is, and it's going to look very different. Okay, and it shouldn't be classified as creative is only what the strict, like, rigid categories of art, like music, painting, sculpting.
Every single thing. I actually would argue that creativity is the core human function. Because
absolutely it is.
Was what allowed us to be tool makers at the beginning, to come up with fire, which allowed us to cook, and then our brains to expand to create language, which allowed for large-scale collaboration. Yeah. And how you use language is absolutely creation. I was at a leadership thing once, and I heard this one quote. I don't remember the context at all, but the quote has always stuck with me. He said, the first person who put in a urinal was an artist. The second was a plumber. It's like, I don't care what the realm is that you're talking about. Yeah. Every single person, you are creating something around you. Whether it's a life, every conversation you have is creating a relationship. Like, we are creative. It is the human thing. Yeah. And so to see yourself as not creative is actually to see yourself as less than you are.
Less than human.
Less than human.
I considered him a friend at the time. I was in my, I would say I was probably in my late 20s, early 30s. And he was, I think, late 60s, early 70s. And he had been a circuit designing circuit boards. Yeah. His own company. Yeah. And he had done it. And his thing was, I do the things that no other company can do. So if somebody reaches out and says, hey, nobody can create this circuit board for me, it hasn't been created yet, he's like, that makes me so excited. And one day he invited me over his house. He says, please, you got to come over. I want to show you what I do. And I walked in, and oh my gosh, I was overwhelmed when I walked into his tiny little room where he did all his work, because it was clutter. It seemed to me like utter chaos. And I'm pretty tolerant of chaos as a 7. I do pretty well. But it was just overwhelming, and I felt claustrophobic. But I sat there with him, and I listened to him, and he sounded like a child.
Just excitement.
So much joy, so much possibility. Yeah. He had never, his joy, his creativity had never aged. It only got better.
That's awesome.
And he was telling me, the other day, Joel, this company reached out to me, and they were trying to solve this problem, and they couldn't figure. So they reached out to me, and they said, nobody's created this yet. It's not out there. Are you able to do it? And he said, oh man, I don't know, but I'm certainly going to try. And he said, and I felt it, both anxious and excited. And so he says, I go to bed that night, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, how's this? And he said, and during the night, he had this epiphany, and he woke up and he couldn't stop working. He just went at it, right? And he says he worked like crazy number of hours to solve this. It's like, well, that's what happens when creative energy kicks in, right? It's like, I want to do this. Yeah. And it's in a flow state, and he just went at it and he solved it. So he couldn't wait. He was just so excited to tell me about what he had done in a space that for the most part, nobody would ever consider
Yeah.
people that do this, that design that do any kind of circuitry work as artists. And yet he certainly saw himself as one.
Yeah, he's absolutely an artist. Part of me like laughs because I think someone could be like, well, why are you working so many hours? Why are you do this? Why aren't you just like kind of take it easy, like work a little bit, like have this balance? I'm sure he creates balance in other areas, but when you fall in love like with something, like you don't want to stop. You just like, oh, I've got to get this thing. Like I'll take a break.
Yeah.
But there is something about that. And I think a lot of times people fall in love with a result, but not the process.
Mm-hmm.
And what you want to do with things that you really find meaningful, you will actually fall in love with the process, not just the result. And that's what his story reminded me of, because he loved the whole process of like, well, I don't know how to do that. I'm going to have to figure this out. And then once I have an idea, then I've got to try my idea and I got to get to work on it and like taking it apart. Like with this book that we've been working on, I love like, I'm just like, oh, I can't wait to like make that chapter like 10% better or 5% better. Or like, oh, what about this sentence could be thing? And I don't like this word usage. Like, I love that process.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's something about whenever you're doing something, like my energy just goes woo, and I have to actually be careful that I don't talk too fast because, like, even this topic, I'm so interested in it, I'm having to occasionally intentionally slow myself down from the rate that I would like to.
Well, because you've seen the fruit and the results of having helped people land that and discover that, right?
Yeah,
and it's like,
I mean, personally, others,
and then helping others. And that's one of the wonderful things about what we're doing is talking about something that is so possible.
Yeah.
And some of you might be asking yourselves, okay, how do you do that in a practical way? Well, a lot of that comes through coaching. You know, I wish I could give universals to figuring out your creativity, but if I do, it's not going to be tangible enough for you. But there is a process, and it is through your type. It is through your instincts.
Yep.
And it is through those questions about, you know, what happens when you're completely in love? What happens when you're feeling really positive about the world? What is it that you do? What do you create? I mean, these are helpful ways to begin and start to, that's how I began. That's how I did what I was doing in 2016. You know, when I was in full burnout, I started just doing that. Like, what is it that I do? And at first I was like, nothing, because I was so burnt out. I didn't want to, like, everything sounded so overwhelming. And so I want to say that to folks out there, if you're feeling so burned out, it's going to be hard. If you're feeling wounded, deeply wounded by something, nothing's going to really give you that. That's okay. Your brain is in a survival place, right? Yeah, the instinct that you're drawing on right now is the self-preservation instinct, what we call the farmer instinct. And that is so important. Like, honor that. Actually be gentle and be kind and be loving to that space because it's protecting you, right? And then as you do that, it'll move it a little bit faster. And then when you're fixated and you're hard on yourself, it'll move it a little bit more fluidly. You'll pass through that stage and you'll begin to feel that space again to imagine and to remember. A lot of it is remembering. It's like, what did I love when I was younger? What was it that I was naturally doing without even awareness that I was doing?
Those patterns were there from the start.
They were there from the start.
I think you have to actually explore even your own childhood and your own story to like actually know what some of this stuff is. It's like a really important component of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because it's probably always there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you find meaning where you give meaning. So thank you for joining us. We are very excited about this next season and where this is going. We have a book coming out next month called Hunters, Farmers, and Teamers, but we are excited to have you on this journey with us. And we are anticipating some really wonderful things this year. So you can get in contact with us at theartofgrowth.org. You can follow us on Instagram at just Art of Growth. And if you leave us a review or share this episode, it's the best way to help the show. We're so thankful to all of you who have put us here, and we are leaning into that gratitude this holiday season, of which we hope you have a really great one. But we will be back next week. Grace and growth, my friends.